this API interacts with our components exactly same way as a user will interact with it. API which provides us ComponentHarness, and we no more care how he opens the select. We just call the method of the harness within our test case, open the select. And this host selector is responsible for identifying the component harness with the component which is used within DOM. So, as already Grzegorz said, I am Mateusz Stefańczyk and I am one of the Angular team leader in the house of Angular, and today I'm gonna talk about the testing with component harnesses. So maybe at the beginning I will ask how many of you have been using the component harnesses already within your projects. Okay, so only one person. So we'll have a good occasion to listen why, from my perspective, it's just a good solution to go for. So let's start with agenda. We will discuss what are the component harnesses, what are the benefits of using the component harnesses. I will go through the building block of the harnesses from the perspective of the author, but also from the perspective of the consumer, because we don't have to always be the author of the harnesses. Library we use might deliver it. And I will show you a very short example of the checkbox component harnesses, which I created by myself on the Stack Blitz. So we are briefly go through that one. Okay, so what are the component harnesses? If you would like to say it in the one sentence, we would say that the component harness is a class that lets a test interact with the component via supported API. So this API interacts with our components exactly same way as a user will interact with it. What's more, it provides us with the isolation from the component implementation details. So when we communicate through this API, we are no more depends on the components implementation details, which I will explain a little bit deeper soon. And component harness pattern is based on the PageObject pattern, which is commonly used within integration testing. So those of you who maybe know the PageObject pattern may notice some similarities across of my presentation. Let's take a look how it will look graphically. So there is a first case. Let's say we have app component, in scope of which we have the select component, and selecting this some kind of the option in scope of this select will affect our app component. But let's focus on this small unit like select component and interaction of that one. I prepare some steps which we'll for sure have to take in scope of our test case to manipulate that select component. So first of all, we'll have to select element inside of child component view. If we want to find it, we have to provide some query or selector by which we'll be looking for that one. Then we have to trigger on it some click event to open it. Then we have to find in scope of the open select options of that select, and again trigger the select option in scope of these options to somehow select something within that component. And as we can see, there is really a lot of secondary work first, so which we will have to repeat within each test case, which will be using this select component. So it's most common interaction, and this interaction we will have to repeat within each of our test case. What's more, as I said, we depend at some implementation details, so we can imagine what will happen when we have been selecting this select element based on the class or something. So whether author of this component change the class name, each of our components test will already breaks because there is no such a class in scope of the select component. So let's take a look at the second scenario when our test case interact only with the API which provides us component harness, and we no more care how he opens the select. We just call the method of the harness within our test case, open the select. But we are no more interested what is the class of this select, how to find this select, whether this select is, I don't know, within a view or maybe it's disabled and something will not work, or how to select nth option. We are not interested to look throughout the options, whether this option is already opened, and to click on them. This entire responsibility is moved to the component harness, and the author of the harness is responsible for handling the common behavior of its component. We are only triggering the options which are somehow representing the behavior of component. So right now there is no couple dependencies on any kind of the selector, classes, attributes, nothing. Everything is in scope of the component harness. Okay, so what are the benefits from those which we already have mentioned? For sure is reusability. So we use same logic across all of our components. We no more care about the finding elements, clicking over the elements. Everything is close in scope of the harness and happens there. Readability. So the harness methods are pretty well described. So as you saw, it was like open select. You don't have to think why he is just doing the document query, select, and click over this, what he find by this, querying this document, and so on. The readability is great. And refactor freedom. It's especially from the perspective of author. If he decide to just rename class of his elements, if he decide to remove the div, which he thinks is no more needed, he can do this and be safe that for sure he will not break other people's tests, because they depends on the harness, and if harness, as long as it have to just follow the same behavior, provide the same behavior of my component, I am safe, because no one should depend on my elements, no one should depend on my classes, they should depend at my harness and communicate with my component throughout this harness. Okay, so I distinguish 3 building blocks of the harnesses when we want to create it or just consume it. The first one is component harness class. It's the base abstract class, which each component harness have to extend. It's provide us with below set of the methods, which are responsible for dedicated to finding the elements, but in scope of the component DOM, what is important. But what's more, we can see there that these methods do not directly find the elements, they return as the functions which finds the elements. And why is this approach chosen there? This approach safeguards us against caching references. So if we use, for example, ngIf, and it once hides and shows the element, in this case, it's completely new DOM structure. And using the functions, we ensure that we are always operating at the current DOM state, so that we don't have some cache reference to the element which no more exists within a DOM. Yeah? I can briefly go through these functions, but as I said, they are mostly dedicated to find the element in scope of the component DOM. The differences between them is just the purpose and expected result. So in case of the locator for, it will return the promise with the test element or will reject the promise. Locator for optional will do exactly the same, but in case of the not finding the element, it will return as the null. And locator for all will look for the collection of the elements and will behave exactly same as a locator for. Host returns the instance of our component. And this test element, okay, first we'll go through a small example. I forgot about this one. So as you can see, there is also a static property host selector, which each of the component harness who extend the component harness class have to implement. And this host selector, I have defined it at the very top, is responsible for identifying the component harness with the component which is used within DOM. Yeah, so in most cases, about within 100% cases, this host selector should be exactly same as a selector of corresponding component on directive to which this harness is dedicated. And below, as you can see, I just use this locator for, and I am looking for the item who has the attribute data test equal my selector, which is hoa-checkbox --input. So I even write it there, what kind of the attribute this input should have and what kind of the attribute I'm looking for. So I'm looking for the input with, even not the input, looking for element with that attribute. And in scope of the protected input, I have the function which will return this element. In scope of the promise, all will reject the promise if it will not find the element. So the next building block are the test element. So as I mentioned, test element are returned by the locator functions. And TestElement it's the design abstraction, which is designed this way. It should work across the different environments, not only the Karma and unit tested, but also in scope of the Selenium environment and so on. It depends on the implementation of that abstraction. What's more, we never should interact with our DOM elements different way than throughout the test elements. We shouldn't make in scope of the harnesses something like document query or something, because this harness might not work in the different environments. And another best practice in scope of the test element, we should never expose them throughout our harnesses. So that I had the input example, we should never expose it to the user throughout our harnesses. What we should do instead, we should provide our user, our consumer, with an actions, more narrow functions, which focus at the behavior of our component or the state of our component we would like to share to our consumer. So in this case, I am created the function isDisabled, which first, as using the await, reads the input element and then checks at this element whether it have the property disabled. And this also return the promise, and then I just evaluate this promise using await disabled. Here the function from Angular to just narrow some types to the Boolean. And that's it. So for, let's say, my example, I just not exposing the input and let the user to check by himself whether my component is disabled. If I know that my component could be in disabled state, I would rather expose the method which provide him with the information regarding the state of my component, so whether it's disabled, instead of letting him to just use this input and check it by itself. Okay, and another building blocks, and the last one I would say, is TestbedHarnessEnvironment. It's just environment we use to load our harnesses. In this case, it's TestbedHarnessEnvironment, but it might be also Selenium harness environment and so on. And this class provides us with the set of the methods dedicated to initialize the loader for loading harnesses. And these loaders can have the different scope, how far they should look for these harnesses. And loader is looking in scope of our fixture, for example, but document root loader, we will look for the harness which will match the provided component throughout the entire HTML, entire rooted HTML. So in case when we will have to initialize or load the harness of dialog, which is rooted at the very bottom of our entire view, we will rather need to use the document root loader instead of the loader who will search only in scope of the tested component, because we have to go far beyond our component. Okay, and TestbedHarness usage is pretty simple. Mostly it's in scope of before each function, or the function which is run before each of the tests, because in my scenario, I create such a before each by myself and test it in scope of each it instead of doing it in this way. And we can see there we are initializing our loader using TestbedHarnessEnvironment loader and providing our fixture, which in this scenario is my app component. So this loader will look for the components and harnesses only in scope of that fixture. Okay, and right now I will move to my code, which is on the StackBlitz. So small refactor there. Okay, and I have it. So let me know whether you can see it or not. Okay, already made some changes. So I will first start with app component. It's pretty simple component. It just have a few HOA checkboxes on the view, and especially nothing special. And we have the app component specs, which is also nothing fancy. I will just for the while comment this test because that's one which breaks. we can see the pretty classical setup of the test environment and my test setup. As I said, I use the test setup, which I trigger in scope of each it. And I do it because when I am using the test setup function, I can provide it with some kind of the options with which I would like to initialize my test environment. If I will have there before each, I will not be able to provide some initial values when running testbed configuration. So I mostly use it to provide the state of the component instance. Okay, and we'll take a look at my HOA checkbox component. It's very simple component. It contains just 3 inputs regarding whether it's disabled, whether it's checked, and whether it's indeterminate. And it looks like that. So nothing fancy. And right now, take a look at my harness. So it's same harness we have been already seeing during the presentation. So I have my selector, it's HOA checkbox. So as I said, it's exactly same as the selector of my component. What's more, I have the locator for my input, which in my case is the checkbox. This input should have the attribute data test equal HOA checkbox. In this case, it's underscore. I will show you then why. Input. And you can see that I have set this attribute on my input. And also in case I have it in my label, but in this case it's different nomenclature. So data test attributes are data HTML attributes. You can set after the data dash whatever you want. Cypress would recommend you to use data dash CI. We use data test because we want to have the single selector for all the test environments we use. Yeah, so we test in scope of the unit test. We use data test, and it's not somehow correlated with the test environment or test tool like data CI, which strictly says data Cypress or something like that. What's more, there is a possibility to, during build in scope of your Webpack, implement some kind of the function which will remove that attributes completely from your build. So you don't have to be afraid that your build size will increase due to adding such attributes. Okay, and what's more I have in scope of my function, I have the isDisabled function, which I showed you already. I have isIndeterminate. It's very similar, so I'm just getting the property and validating whether it's indeterminate. I can validate whether it's checked exactly same way. If I would like to, I could just provide the function which will just click over this element, and I could name it like, I don't know, click or select, but it will be more like click because when clicking we can just change the state from enable. Okay. There is some problem with the stack blitz sometimes. Okay, so that's it. Let's go to the tests right now. So I make a small comparison, but this test, due to some stack blitz related reason, may fail, but let's take a look only. So what we have there is like the classical way we would go with our test. So first we will instantiate our fixture. It's instantiated in scope of the test setup function, so we are fine then. And there we are using query selector to find us an input. So we already have this couply dependency at the implementation details of my checkbox component because you are depending on my data test attribute, and I already see why it breaks because I changed the input attribute. So let's bring it back. So this is how it will look normally. So you will first find some element using query selector, using some kind of the selector you would like to. Probably you will open the developers tools and look what kind you attach to. And then using this instance, you will check the attributes. So something very similar I have already done in scope of the harness. in the comparison to the harnesses, you will just use the loader, which I already showed you is instantiated in scope of my test setup function, and getHarness, use method getHarness and provide the class hoa checkbox harness, and then you will use only checkbox harness and is disabled and validate whether it's true or not. I just provide it with the disabled true, so we can assume it's true and our test pass. If I will change it for the false, it should break. Yeah, we can see that one of the tests has just break. Okay, so let's say you're just using some external library. It might be the Angular material and you used my mat checkbox and they decided, or hoa material library, and we decided to change the attributes. We don't want anymore the underscores, or we don't want anymore some class. So what we will have done, we will go to our component. We'll check the data test to something like that. Of course, we will update our harnesses that every consumer of our library will be safe. And what happens right now? So one test is failing. So let's take a look. And the test which is failing is this one, which had the coupling for some internal dependencies of my library. Yeah? And doesn't matter whether it will be data test, whether it will be some div, which we decide to remove, or whether it will be some kind of the class we decide to rename or just completely get rid of it because we found it's not valuable anymore. Your tests, all of your tests will break. So that's one of the huge benefits of the harnesses. You may ask me, okay, so what when I want to have the 3 checkboxes across of my page and I would like to use loader only for this one dedicated. So in scope of the harnesses, we can define the with static function, which will accept the base harness filters, and this is some kind of thing like the options. And in scope of that options, we can define what should be selector of the component our harness should operate on. So let's take a look. When I have the, let's say, checked true, and I have something like checked false. Okay, so let's do, okay, let's make it false for the while. Let's rename that it will not fail anymore. Okay, and here we have like should be checked, and let's define with selector, and we can provide there the selector. What is the selector of that one? Okay, it's data test, something like that. Okay, I need to make it different. So, and remove that one. And let's refresh it. And you can see it's failed, yeah, because I said it should be true, but this exactly component, which I would like to validate with my harness, is false, have the checked false. So if I check it to be falsy, everything should work. Yeah, so that's it from my side. I hopefully was able to provide you with all kind of the benefits I see within using the harnesses, and just other people see who recommends it. What I can say that also the Angular material provides us with the harnesses for each of them components. So whoever of you is using the Angular material, you can start using them component harnesses and just be safe. So that's it. Thank you. I don't know whether there are some questions.
So it's the responsibility of the component owner to write the harness for their own component, right?
Yeah.
And so in a large code base, it may happen that various developers choose different names for functions. As you presented, some people will say click, other people will say select, other people will say choose. What do you think is the best way to maintain consistency across harnesses in your project?
Yeah, so I would say it's same way as you will, provide some consistency in naming the properties, whether you will choose the camel case or some other case. There is no golden rule. So what you can do, for example, I can think of maybe some kind of the ESLint rule you can create by yourself or something which will evaluate it. It's maybe pretty big effort, but I think it's achievable. But if not, you have to learn each other, you have to agree each other for some standards and keep them and execute them throughout the code review and so on. That's how we learn each other and provide the standards. Yeah, but if you would like something really to happen automatically, I would say maybe some ESLint rule or something.
I have a different question.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you have a harness for a component that is composed of smaller components that also have harnesses. For example, let's say your component has 3 checkboxes, all of them are math checkboxes. Would you rather expose the harnesses of subcomponents or write a method, like a wrapper method that hides the inner harnesses from the user of the larger external harness?
Mm-hmm. So because right now I have to repeat the question, I forgot about the first one. So the question is whether in case in which we have some bigger, more complex component, which in scope of itself has some other smaller components, and each of them have the harnesses, and this big one as well have the harnesses, whether I would expose the smaller component harnesses or will test them separately, or how I will handle this case. So that's something we even have been discussing today, how to handle the bigger, more I have to say complex component, and it honestly depends what kind of these components, these small components are, because if are some kind of the inputs, they can have them own, let's say, harnesses, and they can be tested separately by themselves. But when we are just testing bigger behavior of that component, I will just use these harnesses or extend these harnesses. It depends how we will just handle that one in scope of this one big harness dedicated for this one big component. If they are really strongly coupled and so on, yeah, and that I cannot live or exist or provide the value this component is dedicated to without those components, without interacting with those components, yeah. So I would rather if you would like to achieve some behavior from this one big component, which you are looking to, and you would like to test it, but in the meantime, there are required 5 small steps from these small components, I would rather hide them in scope of this one function in this bigger component, yeah, to do not force user to know what to happen to just select this card or do something with that card, if you know what I mean, yeah.
So you're basically saying if there is a mutation that you want to achieve,
yeah,
which is of several steps, then it's better to.
Yeah, in my opinion, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if there is no question, you are fine. Thank you for being with us there.